Please be seated. So today is the last Sunday before Advent, and since 1925, it has been celebrated as the Feast of Christ the King. It was instituted by Pope Pius XI in 1925, in the midst of the growing power of Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, and Hitler 2 years after the beer hall putsch, and the rise of the Nazi Party and the spread of communism throughout what we now know as Russia, the Soviet Union. He was very concerned in the cyclical called Quas Primas, that which is the leader, that which is the head, that which is the prime thing. Because, as you know, Marx had said, religion is the opiate of the people. It's not real. What's real is this world. Because Mussolini and Hitler were challenging the church, Mussolini was turning church schools into public schools and trying to de-emphasize the power, the significant power that the papacy and the church had over Europe and especially Italy. He was worried. He was worried about the growing nationalism and fascism that he saw, of the winds of war post-World War I and the inklings of them coming with Hitler and Germany. And so he said, we need to remember that the only real kingdom is the kingdom of God, and that the only king that we Christians care about is Christ the King. And interestingly, immediately after he did it, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Methodists just piled on and said, absolutely, we're having a feast day called Christ the King. It's pretty clear in the scene we have of the semi-trial that Pilate holds for Jesus before he is crucified, that Pilate's notion of what a king is and Jesus' notion of what a king is, they're very different. And very different from what we think of as kings in our time. A king in biblical times, including the time of Jesus, was a person who seized power, was rarely given it, and who had power because he had a very powerful army that had defeated other armies, usually subjugated those peoples, often enslaved them, and they ruled through violence and coercion. I am more powerful than you, and I'll kill you if you don't do it. That's what kings were in their time, even in their time. So when Pilate says, are you a king? He is asking, do you have an army? Are you leading an insurgency against the Roman Empire? And Jesus answers with this ambiguous, my kingdom is not of this world. And then Pilate asks him, well, then what's going on? Notice that Jesus says to him, who's asking? Do you ask this of your own accord, or have others asked you to ask this? Because he's trying to get at, what are you thinking for yourself? What is going on in your own mind, your own spirit about who this person standing in front of you? And I also want to point out unequivocally that when Pilate says Jesus says, I'm going to be handed over to the Jews, he doesn't mean all the Jews. He means the people who are agitating against him, the chief priests, the Pharisees, and other people who are worried about how Jesus is shaking up society. He himself was Jewish. All of his followers were Jewish, and John was Jewish. So John is not saying the Jews are the bad people in this story. But notice that Jesus says, if I were your kind of king, my followers would have not let me get arrested. They would be rising up against me. Do you see anybody, rising up against you? Do you see anybody rising up against you, Pilate? The obvious answer is no. But then Pilate says, but you are some kind of king. And he says, I am here to testify to the truth, and that people who belong to the truth will listen to my word. So it's a very different kind of kingdom. He rules it with love. He talks about a God who rules the world and all of creation through love. But he also implies that it's a more powerful kingdom in many ways. It's the Alpha and Omega kingdom, the kingdom of the God that created all, that was from the beginning and will be beyond what we call time. When there is a thing beyond time, when everything else is gone, he's there. So here's the question for that king, that all-powerful king. Why not end all suffering? Why not just take over this world? It's not going great. In the history of humanity, it's war after war, seizure after seizure, illness, plagues, earthquakes. Why not take over? Be honest. The people at 7:30 were not completely honest, I want to tell you. How many of you have ever uttered the prayer, God, why don't you just come down and fix it all? Say you're way more honest than the people at 7:30. The 3 people raised their hand, and I said, oh, come on, I don't believe you. Why aren't you down here fixing this war, ending that war, ending COVID? Why aren't you doing it? So, many mystics and philosophers and basic everyday believers have asked that very question. And 2 of them, who I've often found in dialogue with one another, are the theologian Paul Tillich and the theologian and mystic Julian of Norwich. She's a 14th century woman, the first woman to have written what we would call a work of theology. I think she's the first. Yeah, she is. And then Paul Tillich was a 20th century German theologian. In her case, I'm going to focus mostly on her because she used visions and then later interpreted them in a dialogue with Jesus. She has this vision of a master and a servant, and the master is in fancy robes, sitting on a throne, much like the throne in that passage from Daniel. And there's a ditch in front of him, a muddy, deep ditch, too deep to climb out of, and there is a servant, somebody dressed in poor workers' clothing, slipping around in the mud with a shovel, trying to till the earth. And the master is looking down with grace and beneficence and love. The servant is turned away from God, not able to turn around and look at the master because so beaten down, so exhausted. And when Julian had this vision the first time, she was very perplexed by it. She says, why doesn't the master do anything to help the servant? Why don't you come down here and fix everything? 20 years later, her spiritual directors and others convinced her to write down these visions, and as she wrote them down, she was trying to figure them out. What is this vision telling us? So she prayed, and she got an answer from Jesus. And also, as she relooks at the vision, she realizes that the man in the ditch is not just Adam, but Jesus. You know the book of Romans, how Adam and Jesus kind of get like this? It's also Jesus who came down to the world. And what she realizes is that the man didn't fall into the ditch. The man leapt with joy and love into the ditch. Out of an eagerness to serve God, out of an eagerness to love and take care of what God had given him, the man leapt, but being part of the broken created world, fell, slipped, and was turned away from God. And she asked Jesus, why isn't the master helping? She recognizes that the master is a stand-in for God. And he says, sin is befitting. She was also very upset. I won't describe the other vision. She was very upset about the fact that Jesus went through crucifixion. And she's agonizing about the suffering that Jesus himself bore for us. And he says, I would gladly do it again, over and over again. I did it out of love. But he says to her about the man in the ditch, the same thing. This is the way it's meant to be. Sin is befitting. Think of sin as the brokenness of the world, not just our own personal problems. The struggle is that it is meant to be. And then he goes on to say the famous words, all manner of things are well, all things are well, and all shall be well. It doesn't look like that to the man in the ditch, but all things shall be well. And this gave her peace. What she was saying is, he was telling her that in some way, the brokenness of the world, this world, is necessary. Not for us to work through our sins and suffer so we become better people. That it is simply part of the existence that is separate from the existence of God. Just by our being human in a world that has things happening in it, diseases and earthquakes and so on, and our own folly, these things are going to happen. But that we shouldn't be overly troubled by it, and that Jesus is not overly troubled by it. Remember, he says in the Gospel of Matthew, sin will happen. Just don't be the one who makes other people sin. It's going to happen. So be at some kind of peace with that. Jesus himself enters this world, he points out to her, to enter into the suffering, to say, this is how it goes in our walk with God. Now, that doesn't mean that the kingdom of God is only up there somewhere in the heavens after we die. There is a notion also that the kingdom of God is near or is with us. It's just that most of the time we're beaten down by the world that we're watching on the news or seeing at school or seeing with our relatives on Thanksgiving. And so we get stuck in that. We're turned away. We're looking down at the dirt. We're not turning and looking at the King of Kings. But when we turn and look at him and say, that's right, I belong to the kingdom of heaven, and that the only thing I worship is Jesus and God. I don't worship how nice my clothes are, how nice my car is. I don't worship who's the president or who's going to win the NHL championship. Of course, baseball matters, but other things don't matter. When we can turn away from those things and say, all manner of things are well, all things are well, all things shall be well, and I worship the one King, we can find a piece of the kingdom of God. We kind of visit the kingdom of God for a little while until we finally get there. The other thing about Jesus visiting with us is that he models for us how to be a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, how to live in a relationship of love with God, with one another, and even with ourselves. Now, you might think that question, why do we live, is like a little existential question that people like Paul Tillich ask. But last night on Facebook, on Episcopalians on Facebook, a group on Facebook, a woman asked, why bother staying alive when we're told that there is a kingdom beyond that's way better? I don't think she was asking a philosophical question. And many people responded, hearing perhaps a plea for cry for somebody whose life is too painful for them to endure. They gave her advice about numbers she could call if life is too painful for her to endure. But other people started positing other answers, typical Christian answers. So I said, let's see. I never get in discussions on Episcopalians on Facebook. You don't want to, trust me. But I said, let's see, what would I say to that answer? One is, we are part of God's creation, and we are good. Our catechism says that we are created good in God's eyes. And we are part of a beautiful creation, and part of it is pure appreciation and joy and gratitude and just loving life. That's a great attitude. That's a great answer for those of us who actually love life. I know that there are some people who can't love life, but that's one answer. The sunrise this morning was this gorgeous blue and orange, for example. The sun pouring in on your faces is gorgeous this morning. The vistas from the mountains are gorgeous. The smile of a baby, the fur of a dog. That's one reason to live. The other reason to live is to love and be loved. There are many people who suffer due to illness, who suffer due to depression, who suffer due to other reasons that make life feel not so good, and yet they are aware that they are loved and that they love. My 87-year-old grandmother would say, I just want to see the next great-grandchild. I want to go to the next grandchild's graduation. She loved it until the day she died. She just loved the next thing, the next bit of love in life. And finally, the standard Christian answer, to love and serve the Lord. And that, of course, includes loving and serving one another. Why did Jesus come to the earth? Besides to save us, was to model what it is to love and serve God, and how life-giving it is to love and serve God. And one step further, the very thing he says in his trial, to testify to the truth. So the truth in the world of Jesus and God is that the truth is God. Not the truth, not factual truth like historical truths or scientific truths that are commonly held. Truth is God, pure existence, all that is. That's truth. And he says, I testify to the truth. I'm a witness to the truth, which is that there is a God who rules in the kingdom of God, and Jesus is testifying to it because he knows it, because he is of it. And then notice he says, those who belong to the truth, listen to my voice. He doesn't say those who believe in the truth. It's not just the words of the Nicene Creed said every Sunday. It's something else. It's tapping into a reality that is much deeper than the day-to-day happenings in our day-to-day lives. He models for us how to testify to the truth. Now, remember, I started out in Catholic land, and you don't walk around telling people around you about your faith in Catholic land normally. Maybe they're getting better at it, I don't know. But when my first Episcopal church was rather evangelical in nature, and I don't mean conservative theology, I mean evangelical in terms of really encouraging people to share their faith, which I was extremely reluctant to do, despite believing I was called to be a priest, oddly. And they did an all-church book group by Pastor Rick Warren of the Saddleback Church called The Purpose-Driven Life. Huge bestseller, huge. And basically what this book said is that the purpose of our lives are to love and serve God and to witness to the truth of Jesus to others so that other people can go love and serve God. And I thought, what? Talk to people about my beliefs? Talk to people about my faith? We can't do that. But look at who our King is, what he models for us. He models companionship. He models loving. And he grants us promises. He tells us what life is going to be like to give us hope until the kingdom of God really does merge completely with all of creation and take over. He shows us how to go and love and serve the Lord and testify to the truth. That's our reason for being. So go and love and serve the Lord. Alleluia, alleluia.